Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Carissa Philippi. Dr. Philippi is an associate professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She received her PhD in neuroscience at the University of Iowa, where she conducted research examining the effects of brain injury on self-perception. After finishing graduate school, Professor Philippi conducted neuroimaging research at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to investigate the brain network's underlying psychopathic traits in prison inmates. Her current research seeks to understand the neural mechanisms of maladaptive self-perception in neuropsychiatric conditions, such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. In our chat before platform today, she said she loves fielding questions about her work, and she will be answering them following this platform. So if you would like to note those as she's speaking, I'm sure many will arise, and she would love to answer them for you. So let us welcome Dr. Philippi.
Set up here. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for, can you? Closer. Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Okay, good. Sure, no problem. Absolutely. Don't want to make extra noise for you guys. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here today speaking with all of you, especially during this month of June, where your theme is really relevant to the talk today, specifically discussing this idea of how we can accept responsibility for our choices and actions. But before we go further, I just wanted to thank the Ethical Society of St. Louis for inviting me to give this talk today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterward. I really do enjoy that kind of active discussion, so looking forward to that. I'd also like to thank my colleagues at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I did that neuroimaging research with prison inmates with psychopathy. And then finally, I'd like to thank the undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Missouri-St. Louis, where I teach courses really relevant to this topic, specifically on clinical neuropsychology, where we cover lots of cases and similar ones that we'll talk about today. So one question that you may be asking is, how can we study something as complex as criminal behavior as it relates to the brain? Is it really possible to localize criminal behavior to a single brain region? Well, of course, as you may already know, that's not likely to be the case, but we'll talk about different cases that speak to that, taking two different approaches. So first, we'll look at patients with brain injury to see how that brain injury relates to changes in behavior. So specifically, when I'm talking about brain injury, that would be focal brain damage, potentially due to a stroke, or a tumor that is growing and disrupting the normal functions of that region. It also may be the case that an individual has this brain tumor and it's removed or surgically resected and results in actually changes in those violent impulses. So really decreasing that desire to engage in criminal behavior. We also have brain imaging that we can use to look at how brains are functioning and structurally different in individuals who engage in antisocial behavior, such as individuals with psychopathy. So in terms of the outline of this talk, today I'll first discuss cases of individuals with brain injury that led to the onset of different types of criminal behavior. Then I'll discuss brain imaging in individuals or prison inmates with psychopathy. And then finally, I'll kind of raise some ethical and legal considerations and talk about the limitations of using neuroimaging in legal cases. Before I go on, I just wanted to provide a brief disclaimer that my expertise is in clinical neuropsychology and neuroscience as opposed to criminal law and really ethics. But that being said, I really do look forward to that discussion after the talk. So when we think about the relationship between brain injury and criminal behavior, one of the most famous cases is the case of Phineas Gage. Many of you may be familiar with this case already. This was a 25-year-old man who was a railroad foreman, and he had an accident during an excavation constructing that railroad. Specifically, he had a tamping iron that went through the left side of his face and exited his skull. Miraculously, we would think, how is this person still living, talking? It seems impossible. But yet, Phineas Gage maintained the ability to talk and also maintained levels of general intelligence. But importantly, he had issues and significant changes in his personality, in his social behavior, and in his decision-making. So if we think about how he was before injury, speaking with his friends and his family members, he was described as being efficient, capable, polite, a smart businessman. After injury, he was described as fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, really not exhibiting any care for others. You know, he used to really be very involved at work and be able to interact with his colleagues very smoothly. And afterwards, that wasn't the case. Finally, he engaged in and made lots of poor decisions in terms of business decisions. So he got himself into a lot of trouble that way. So really, this case provides us with support that later on it was discovered that this tamping iron created damage to the frontal cortex, but specifically the medial prefrontal cortex. If I might pause a moment, I'm going to grab some water. So later, more modern cases really provided additional support for this case of Phineas Gage, specifically implicating the medial prefrontal cortex in these same symptoms that were later described as pseudopsychopathy or acquired sociopathy. This figure shows that region of the medial prefrontal cortex. Don't worry, I won't be quizzing you on the name of that region if you're worried. But these cases really did show similar symptoms to the case of Phineas Gage. Specifically, individuals exhibited diminished guilt, shame, and empathy. They also were poor in terms of their planning abilities. They were irresponsible, impulsive, also displayed similar coarse language as we heard about with Phineas Gage, as well as, really lacking the ability to behave appropriately in social situations. So again, this provided support and was consistent with this case of Phineas Gage, linking the frontal lobe to antisocial behavior. But you may be wondering, what are the normal functions of the medial prefrontal cortex in healthy individuals without brain injury? Well, maybe not surprisingly, the medial prefrontal cortex is more active when we're doing and engaging in different functions that are related to social behavior or antisocial behavior. So specifically when we're viewing images that evoke different types of negative emotions and our ability to regulate those negative emotions. Also when we're engaging in tasks that might ask us to think about moral decisions, think about moral dilemmas, which are sort of classic in the field of philosophy, thinking about trolley car dilemmas. And then also in the case of decision making. So again, these different functions really highly overlap with those symptoms that we saw in those individuals who have damage to the medial prefrontal cortex. But besides the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe has also been implicated in different types of antisocial behavior. Specifically, tumors that compress the amygdala have been shown in certain cases to lead to the onset of rage, aggression, and different violent acts. So here, this figure on the left is showing in orange the location of the amygdala in the brain. And on the right, you can see an MRI scan of a patient. This was a pediatric case of a patient that had a tumor that was growing in the temporal lobe. This tumor in this child was associated with more violent behavior at school, such that they were actually kicked out of school. The reason why this tumor was ultimately resected was actually not necessarily because of this aggressive behavior and violent behavior, but was actually because it was associated with seizures, so seizure onset. After removing this tumor, not only did those seizures stop, but this aggressive behavior also stopped. And this kid was later interviewed to try to determine how they experienced life now after they have this decrease in these aggressive impulses. And they said that they remembered engaging in those violent behaviors, but they just didn't have those same impulses anymore. So it does suggest that there is this link between aggression and the amygdala. But again, what are the normal functions of the amygdala? So we know that the amygdala is really important for fear and aggression, maybe not surprisingly. And it's also the case that the amygdala is really important in fear-related aggression. And so we know this from studies in animals where we've looked at activity in the amygdala while animals are doing different tasks that involve, say, intruder paradigms. So for example, there are studies where they've taken hamsters who are in their home cage and an intruder hamster that comes in. When that intruder comes in, that hamster attacks. When they're attacking, they are having that defensive aggression. They have increased activity in the amygdala. So again, that's consistent with the role of the amygdala in aggression. It's also the case that there are animal and human studies that have shown that if you damage the amygdala, you do decrease levels of aggression and fear. So specifically, these studies were done in monkeys where they lesioned the amygdala and other regions of the temporal lobe, and they found that these monkeys were no longer afraid of snakes. So you may or may not realize that monkeys are normally sort of innately afraid of snakes, and these monkeys then had no fear of those snakes. Interestingly, this also affected their social behavior. So they were more likely to approach other monkeys that were more dominant, that were higher in that hierarchy, that they normally would not approach. So again, this lack of fear suggests also this lack of social disinhibition that some people may have. These findings in monkeys were later confirmed by studies in humans with bilateral amygdala damage. So there's a case that is somewhat well known of patient SM. Patient SM, when tested, had trouble recognizing fear in other people's faces, but they also did other studies that looked at realistic or naturalistic settings and how she responded to situations that could evoke fear in some of us. And so one of those was to visit an exotic pet store. So they had her visit an exotic pet store. She had reported as a kid to be very afraid of snakes and spiders. So when she went into the exotic pet store, instead of acting very fearful and not wanting to touch any of the snakes or spiders, she actually wanted to hold them all. And she also wanted to hold some of the most poisonous spiders that they had, even though the person who was working there was sort of afraid of her lack of fear toward these different types of pets. So, and then this also did affect her social behavior. So they also did a study to look at social distance, which a lot of us are maybe particularly aware of right now, that we want to maintain a more distance between each other. But patient SM actually doesn't abide by those same social distances, and so she'll just go up to people almost to the point of touching their nose. She doesn't mind being very close to people that she doesn't even know very well. So again, that suggests that lack of social disinhibition, similar to what we saw in monkeys. So besides the frontal and temporal lobes, more recent research has implicated networks that may be important for criminal behavior. Specifically, they looked at cases of 17 individuals who had lesions to different regions, including in the frontal and temporal lobes, and they wanted to see what are those regions functionally connected to. What regions are those other regions that were damaged communicating with? And what does that tell us about the networks within the brain that may be altered in these individuals? And what they found, maybe not surprisingly, is that all of these individuals overlapped in terms of their lesions being functionally connected to the medial prefrontal cortex and amygdala that we talked about earlier. So it suggests that maybe the connections or the communication between the amygdala and the medial prefrontal cortex may be particularly important in social behavior, but also regulating our emotions and regulating our impulses in order to ensure that we don't engage in these different types of criminal behavior. So next we'll talk about brain imaging and psychopathy. And specifically thinking about how brain imaging can tell us about the brain regions that are involved in antisocial behaviors. Psychopathy and the symptoms of psychopathy are very similar to the symptoms of pseudopsychopathy that we talked about earlier, except that psychopathy is really associated with a more standardized, more rigorous assessment. So if you're assessing individuals for different psychopathic traits, this would involve an extensive interview that goes over different items that focus on different types of emotional and social and antisocial traits. And then this would also involve an analysis of, say, their transcripts and speaking with other individuals to kind of verify that this behavior has been happening for a long time. That being said, psychopathy has been associated with frontal and temporal lobe changes or abnormalities. So specifically, there's some evidence that there's reduced activity and a reduced size in the medial prefrontal cortex in individuals with psychopathy. This image is from a study that's looking at the brain structure or size of different areas and how that's different in individuals with psychopathy. And those regions in blue are those areas that, maybe you can take my word for, are also overlapping with that medial prefrontal cortex. In addition, there's evidence for heightened or greater activity in the amygdala in individuals with psychopathy, as well as other emotion-related brain regions when they're engaging in different types of emotional tasks or moral decision-making tasks as well. Interestingly, there's also some evidence for abnormal communication between the frontal and temporal lobes in psychopathy. So in this study, they looked at the integrity of the white matter connections that can allow the frontal or medial prefrontal cortex to communicate with the amygdala. And so that's shown in this figure here, where we see that there's decreased integrity of the white matter connections between the medial prefrontal cortex and amygdala in individuals with psychopathy, such that if they have greater psychopathy traits, they have fewer connections between those regions, again suggesting that that's disrupted. Consistent with that, other studies looking at functional connectivity, so the communication between those two regions, also found evidence for decreased communication between these frontal and temporal lobe areas. So in terms of the legal and ethical considerations, we'll talk about those, as well as the limitations of neuroimaging that I think are very important to consider. So we know that in a court of law, to be found guilty, a person has to have intentionally and knowingly committed an act. So the exception to this would be in cases where there's an insanity plea. And these pleas usually are used to mitigate sentencing and other factors. But, most often when we hear about a plea of insanity, we may think about the evaluation that's being presented from a psychiatrist or a psychologist. But it's actually the case that brain imaging can also be used to support this not guilty by reason of insanity plea. So that brings up the question of, in what cases does it make sense to use brain imaging for criminals? In what situations might we want to do that? Might we want to do that when there's a situation where someone is going to receive the death penalty or life in prison? And then in that case, we just reduce the sentence, but we're not completely exonerating someone by using brain imaging. Ethically, what if it's the case that we do brain imaging for one criminal, but we don't do it for someone else? And then later it turns out that that other person that we didn't do brain imaging for actually does have a brain abnormality that led to this criminal behavior. So it's challenging to consider that. Also, really related to the topic this month at the Ethical Society, thinking about if these brain imaging abnormalities are identified, what does that tell us about whether this individual is morally responsible or morally blameworthy? Really related to this idea of not guilty by insanity. Also, are they legally culpable? There have been some cases where individuals have used brain imaging and they have not been found to be legally responsible. What does that mean? Also, the likelihood of recidivism. If we were able to use brain imaging and we had the technology available to be able to predict whether an individual is likely to reoffend, we would want to know that, I would assume. But as we'll talk about, we may not be there yet in terms of neuroimaging. And then more sort of broadly, thinking about just how we consider responsibility in general. Do we accept responsibility for our actions if we know that we see these brain lesions, brain damage, or these changes in brain activity that are associated with antisocial behavior? Does that mean that we're responsible? Those are questions that we need to grapple with when we think about whether we're using brain imaging in these legal cases. But again, it's important that we think about, in legal cases in particular, we're just using brain imaging as one piece of evidence. It's not meant to really exonerate that individual and be used as the only piece of information. So I wanted to talk just briefly about a couple cases where brain injury was more directly linked to the onset of criminal behavior. So there was a surgeon who, after completing the surgery, carved his name into the patient's stomach. And it was later found that this surgeon had Pick disease, which is a type of dementia that's associated with the degeneration of the frontal and temporal lobes. This surgeon was later found not guilty, both by the jurors and by the patient themselves. So this individual was not found guilty. There was another case of a 40-year-old man who exhibited sort of a sudden onset of impulsive sexual behavior and a desire to engage in pedophilia. This individual was convicted, but then later found on brain scan to have a tumor that was growing in his medial prefrontal cortex. After removing that tumor, those impulses significantly diminished, almost to the point of not having them anymore. And then years later, these impulses came back, and it turned out when doing a scan, they found that the tumor was growing back. So that does provide kind of a consistent link, at least between these brain abnormalities and these different types of antisocial or criminal behavior. But of course, things are not this clear-cut all of the time. And often it's really difficult to link this information about brain injury or brain dysfunction and the onset of criminal behavior. So that relates to the limitations of brain imaging that I think are really important when we're thinking about using this in legal cases. Specifically, as you may know, brain imaging is not the same as mind reading. We're not at the point where we can use brain imaging to determine what someone is thinking at one exact moment, the exact thought. We can, of course, use information from brain imaging to predict generally what kinds of content people are thinking about. Are you thinking about faces? Are you thinking about houses? But we can't at the individual level really yet understand what an individual is thinking. And then more importantly, with legal cases, of course, we have an issue of timing. We're not doing brain imaging while someone is engaging in a criminal act. So in that way, of course, how can we really do that? In addition, it's important to mention that the brain imaging measures that we use, while very scientifically valid in many ways, are also very indirect. So here we're correlating behavior with changes in, say, blood flow or blood oxygen, and that doesn't really tell us about neuronal activity. We can't yet look at it at that level, at that time scale, so at the millisecond time scale. In addition, as we talked about in the very beginning, as you all know, criminal behavior is very complex, and we would never want to say, I would never want to say, that criminal behavior is just the result of the brain or biology, but actually a complex interaction with other factors like many things, including genetics, epigenetics, environment. We know that environment can play a role in the development of different psychiatric disorders. So for example, exposure to maltreatment in early childhood is associated not only with the onset of depression and anxiety, but also with antisocial behaviors. So, we need to take environment into consideration as well as other social and cultural factors. And then finally, there are a lot of individual differences that are important to consider when we're thinking about looking at brain imaging for one individual, especially if it's functional brain imaging. So you may or may not know that the anatomy that we have within the brain, the neuroanatomy, is very different from person to person. We also have differences in terms of the functional mapping of different types of functions. So, in one individual, the processing associated with a certain type of emotion, like negative emotion, may be slightly different from another person. So usually when we're thinking about the analysis of brain imaging data, we do it at the group level. We look across a group of individuals and say, these individuals with psychopathy have differences from these healthy comparison participants, not at the individual level, again. So what can we do about that in terms of how we interpret these brain imaging findings in legal cases? And then also, this gets to sort of technical issues, but it is the case that we can use different types of pre-processing methods to then that could potentially change the end result or final result of those images that are eventually being shown in court in these legal cases. And it's also the case that we need to take into consideration potential biases that jurors or judges may have if they're evaluating brain imaging. So there have been studies that have shown that if you're showing someone a picture of the brain with these beautiful colors, people are very prone to thinking that those images are very scientifically valid, and they may pull more weight in a case if they're used. And so that's just something that would involve education for those jurors and for those judges to make sure that they understand that just because we have this brain image doesn't mean that it definitively says that this pattern of function is definitely the cause of this individual's criminal behavior. So with that, I wanted to thank you so much for your attention, and again, look forward to the discussion later on.
James, I'm looking for you. Are you around? Great. James would like to make a brief announcement to us.